Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we are going to be doing the weekly metagame breakdown where we look at the top performing decks in the standard best of 3 ladder. We're going to get the data from Untapped GG, what you see on the screen, companion tool that aggregates user win rates, gives us a whole bunch of cool stats. And we will look at the kind of the play rate of the day and then the deck lists themselves. All the deck lists, and as well as if you want to use Untapped, is linked in the video description so you can copy paste for your heart's content. Just a programming note for the next week or two. My actual full-time job is literally chaos right now. So going to be a little bit more sporadic in terms of videos. We'll get you covered for all the qualifier play-ins and try to do some of the key formats each week. But instead of a video a day, it's probably going to be 3 or 4 videos for the week, for the next coming weeks, so just as I try to balance everything there. But let's jump in and we'll go to it. For a couple of deck lists, it's a little bit weird in terms of the data this week. We're not getting aggregate for them. So I've just highlighted some of the key decks, at least from samples of individual users who have successful win rates with them. I want to just give you a spread of all the viable kind of tier 1, 2 decks that you may be encountering. Now, with that said, standard is pretty wide open. So there's a lot of kind of archetypes you can play around with. In terms of popularity, Dimir Midrange at 10%. This would be kind of inclusive of the traditional midrange as well as the Storm Chaser's Bounce version. There's Domain at 10%. There's Gruul Prowess at 9%. Then we get kind of a drop off, Mono Red Aggro at 5%. We have Gruul Delirium, which has been on an uptick. This is what I played in the RCQ. We played Teams Trios, so it was Modern, Pioneer, and Standard. Ended up going 1-2, lost to Mono White, bet Dimir Mid, and then lost against Dimir Bounce. Close matches, kind of all of them, but it was a fun event anyways. I really like this deck. It's fun to play. Oculus at 5%, Golgari at 5%, and then Mono White Control at 4%. Honestly, Golgari against all the Bounce decks has kind of fallen off, not really showing up in the higher win rate decks. So looking at this week, we have 28,000 games, Diamond and Mythic Rank, and Simic or Terror Beans, whatever you want to call it, highest win rate of the aggregate decks. So this deck here, base is Simic colors in the main. You'll notice a couple Gloom like Verge in the side. This allows you to play some black cards in the sideboard. But the core of this deck is putting cards into your graveyard. By doing so, you get reduced cost on Eddy Merc Crab as well as Tolarian Terror. Those let you draw cards off up the beanstalk. Same with This Town Ain't Big Enough. Another kind of effect that lets you draw cards and plays really nicely with Storm Chaser's Talent or bouncing your own big things or even resetting a beanstalk to get you some value. You're playing only 17 lands because you're using things like Analyze the Pollen, Bushwhack to help you find lands. Same with like Seed of Hope, Unsummon for tempo elements along with Rona's Vortex, and then Sleight of Hand as cheap card draw. In your sideboard, you have your Swamp. You have Swarm Weaver, which is an interesting card here. So 4 mana, 2/3 enters. You create 2 1/1 insects. Then if you have Delirium, then your spiders and insects get +1/1 and have Death Touch. So against something like fairies or anything that's putting out a lot of 1/1s, this can kind of gum up the board. Any of the flying stuff usually are like 1 toughness out of the Dimir deck, so you can block it pretty nicely. You have Tishana's Tidebinder for activated abilities. At one point, Glissa was being played, but because Norita runs everywhere, you're not seeing as many Glissas. The black gives you access to like Terra Sunder, Nowhere to Run, Go for the Throat, Annoyance, so just hard removal. Shrouded Shepherd could be a sweeper that can also be hit off some of your cash grab style effects. Paw Patch, Artifact, Enchantment, Flying, or just card draw. Keen-Eyed Curator as a creature that can be graveyard hate. Mental Misstep for the aggressive deck. Gruul Prowess, so this one is at 74%. So we're seeing 3 Questing Druids main, 2 Innkeeper's Talent in what's basically a base mono red deck. We're also seeing a couple copies of Torch the Tower. A card that you might see in the main board of some of these lists, depending on how Gruul they actually are, is Paw Patch Recruit, since it plays really nicely into the Dimir deck, gives you multiple bodies. When they target it with various things, even just to tap it down, you get to put counters on your other creatures. But this core of the deck, your mouse package, very aggressively slanted. Innkeeper's Talent can trigger the Valiant trigger to give you like card advantage off Emberheart every turn. Sideboard, Lithomantic Barrage, blue and white big things, Torches cheap removal, Obliterating Bolt in here. Notably, no Witchstalker Frenzy in the main. Instead, playing a couple Scorching Shots in the side. Urbrass Forge for the grindier matchups, Questing Druid, same idea, and then Paw Patch for your angels, like your big flyers, your demons, and then enchantment hate as well. Then go to Dimir Midrange. So this is the kind of traditional tempo version, not the bounce version. So this one's at 73%. So you have cheap evasive flyers, things like Spyglass Siren, Fairy Mastermind in here, the Fabloom Trick, good into kind of the mirrors because it gives you multiple bodies, can also tap things down. Then you have a bunch of ways to cheat out Kaido, draw a bunch of cards off Enduring Curiosity. One Preacher main, you have the Spell Stutters as counters with basically 8 pieces of targeted removal mixed in. Soulstone and Restless Reef as creature utility lines. Sideboard, you have Gix Command as a sweeper for the aggressive decks. Against like mid-range matchups, not bad because you can rebuy stuff. Shelly for like mid-range matchups, also kind of a stonewall against the aggro. Activated abilities, kind of the big mana decks. With Tashana's, Preacher for the aggressive decks. You have Edict and Nowhere to Run is more removal along with Anoint. Negate for cheap counters. For non-creature decks, Ghost Vacuum for graveyard focus deck, and Duress for hand hate. We then go to Azorius Oculus at 70%. So we're seeing a 1 of Kiora being played in here, along with the Haughty Djinn and Horde Oculus. Core of this deck is to kind of draw, discard, loot away any of these threats, and then you get them back with Helping Hand or Recommission. You can protect them with like Unsummon if you want to bounce it back to hand, kind of get rebuy value, shore up as a protection effect. Pick Lock helps you kind of mill over, negate as cheap counters if they play like removal, stuff like that. You kind of cheat out a big one and then kill them that way there. Smite for the aggressive decks, Disdainful Stroke for big mana decks, Sweepers, Sunfall, stuff like that. Exercise, Artifact Enchantment, and Big Creature Hate. Against kind of decks that are looking to draw a lot of cards, the Beanstalk decks, stuff like that. You have Fairy Mastermind. Also, if they pivot to a lot of graveyard hate, lets you attack at a different angle. Negates in here, Monastery Mentor, again, if they pivot to a lot of graveyard hate, you can bring in Mentor, go wide, and then split up as well for the aggressive decks. We have Zur Domain, 69%. So this deck here is basically kind of a green-white base deck with some blue in it, and then black for Atraxa and Zur. You have the Impending Overlords, you impend them, get the value immediately, animate them with Zur, attack, get the triggered value that way there. Analyze the Pollen is a 1 mana spell that can hit you your lands early, fix your mana, and then late game could be a tutor for whatever effect you want. Elsewith might get Lost as cheap removal. We're seeing a split of Day of Judgment and Sunfall. Just acknowledging that some games you need the sweeper on 4, not turn 5. You draw a whole bunch of cards off Beanstalk because of the Overlords. Bird Migration fixes your mana, could be a win con later. Leyline Binding could be as little as 1 mana, and then an Atraxa for value. Your sideboard, Authority for the aggressive decks, same with Elsewith Smite. Ghost Vacuum for graveyard hate, Paw Patch enchantment hate, flying. The usual, Beza for the aggressive decks, same with Day of Judgment, and then for heavy discard decks, you have Obstinate Spaloth. Could also potentially be, depending on how aggressive your opponent's deck is, just another way to gain some life early. Mono Red Aggro, 67%. This pretty stock mono red list that we see here. The only difference is some of them are experimenting with Soulstone Sanctuary in it. It's another mouse. If you squint hard enough, that plays nicely with the mouse package. Gives you a little bit more grind against the heavy removal decks, but this deck's been largely the same for the last couple of weeks. The only new change is the Soulstone Sanctuary. Sideboard's gotten a couple updates. We have Lithomantic Barrage, blue and white things, Tectonic Hazard for the kind of... It's pretty reasonable against Dimir. You don't want to play Pyroclasm because it'll kill all your stuff, but this can deal with your opponent's like fairies, any of the small stuff. Against Convoke, it has a window to being pretty reasonable as well. Torch for cheap removal. Case of Crimson Pulse I really liked against the bounce decks, kind of the grind value. Gives you some added benefit there. Because the thing is, Urbrass Forge used to be that default card. And I love Urbrass Forge. I will be #1 Urbrass Forge stan. But Authority of the Consuls makes this card dead. It basically just reads your opponent gains 1 life per turn. And they're already bringing that card in against you, so it's kind of something to pivot in that respect. The case, even if it bounces, you usually could still get some value. You just have to be mindful, because this happened to me at the RCQ. Case, last card in hand, cast it, trigger on the stack. They actually bounced it back to my hand, which forced me to discard it. And then I drew the 2 cards, but I got rid of the case that way, which was a really heads-up play by my opponent. Sunspine Links for the greedy mana-based decks, and other ways to shut off life gain. Mono white tokens, the dread of my Delirium deck. I got Sunfalled 3 turns in a row, turn 5, 6, 7 in a row, and that pretty much knocked me out of game 1. This deck makes a bunch of tokens. Things like Carrot Cake, the Enduring Curiosity draws you cards. Caretaker's Talent draws you cards. Beza makes tokens, draws you cards. This makes tokens, draws you cards. Sunfall clears your opponent's hopes and dreams and makes you a token and draws you cards. Bunch, cheap removal. You have 10 kind of 1 to 2 mana targeted removals to fill it in. Demolition Field for utility lands. Sunken Citadel could reduce the cost. And then Fountain Port has a whole bunch of utility in the deck. Archangel Elspeth for kind of the grindier matchups. Gives you another way to kind of stick a threat, make lifelinkers. Realm Breaker. So usually in this spot you'll see in the kind of the mirrors or against like Domain and stuff, the Jace. This one's strictly mono white, so it's a way to kind of fight that deck by milling them out in the mirror. Lauren, Artifact Enchantment Hate, Graveyard Hate with Rest in Peace, Exercise, Artifact Enchantment and Big Thing Hate, also Smite for aggressive decks, along with Authority of the consoles. Gruul Delirium. So many ways to build this deck. So my version, which I've shared a couple times, there's a sideboard guide for it, for both versions of the Delirium that I built. So that I'll link that in there as well if you want to see the sideboard guide for my take. But this one here won a Japanese tournament. I think it was like 50 plus players. Some of the decks are playing Ren, the Realm Breaker. I'm a fan of not playing Ren, the Realm Breaker. I don't think it's good into the current meta, to be honest, with all the flyers and bounce and stuff. The 3/3 line doesn't do much into a lot of creatures as well. But the core of this deck is basically establishing Delirium. You have a bunch of things with multiple types. Artifact creature, enchantment creature, artifact creature. You have enchantments in here. This version's on Beastie Beatdown. I don't love Beastie Beatdown because it requires you to have a creature in play and it's sorcery speed. So with all the bounce, it plays pretty poorly. One thing with this mana base, don't play Temple of Bandon, don't play Commercial District, play 2 more Thornspire Verges, so I will correct that. Some of these lists, and I was playing 3 Paw Patch Recruit in the main as well, which I really liked. Just lets you play a fair game if they do attack your graveyard. Robobelt Malka is a way to fill your graveyard if you'd like. Seed of Hope, same idea. Violent Urge is basically, if you squint hard enough, it's Embercleave. This version's a split with Monstrous Rage. I was playing 4 Violent Urges. At times, Monstrous Rage could be a little bit more useful. So Breakout's the big card with this deck, so you can cheat out one of your creatures from your hand, almost like a mini Collected Company, giving them haste. Plays really nicely with Fear Missing Out. If you have Delirium, you get the extra combat step right away. Versions on Huntsman as a way to kind of tutor potentially. It's another kind of third effect and enchantment. And then it's also Ominous Flytrap. I don't think this card's very good in the meta right now. Dies to pretty much every removal, bounce, and doesn't do anything. You can't haste it out because it's 3 mana. I think there's just better options in that slot, personally. Against the aggressive decks, you have Screaming Nemesis, like Mono Red, Pyroclasm for Dimir, Pixie, any of the Go Wide strategies, Mono Red, Obliterating Bolt, Torch the Tower, and Lithomantic Barrage, just varied removal options, and then Haywire Might being played in place of Paw Patch Recruit. So this will deal with non-creature enchantments. It's also an artifact in the graveyard that works pretty nicely. Plus and minus, I ended up playing 3 Haywire Might in my tournament because my Paw Patch Recruit in the mail literally came in today, 5 days after the event. So didn't really work out, so I had to do a last second pivot, but it was pretty reasonable, all things considered. It dying to removal is a little rough. So it did force my hand a couple times playing, but it can be found off Breakout, which is nice. So in a pinch, you can also hit that there. The life gain's also not trivial. This version here has no ways to deal with a Shieldred. So I would play 1 to 2 Witchstalker Frenzy, because you do need a way to deal with Shieldred. This deck has a hard time beating that card. Dimir Midrange. So this is the bounce version of the deck. So Storm Chaser's Talent, plus This Town Ain't Big Enough, plus Nowhere to Run. Fear of Isolation can rebalance this card. Same with Hopeless Nightmare. So a really strong engine at attacking your opponent's hand, creatures. In the third match that I had against this deck, in game 2, my opponent used the same Nowhere to Run 4 times, kill 4 of my creatures, which was really demoralizing, just in terms of you create virtual card advantage by recycling your effects. Kaido could be cheated in, same kind of effect. A lot of ways to tap down your opponent's creatures between Kaido and Floodpit's Drowner. Curiosity draws you cards, and then you have the creature land package. Cheap removal, hand hate, graveyard hate, get out can be used in kind of the mirrors, can return your own permanents as well at instant speed, so it gives you some value. Negates for cheap counters. Against the aggressive decks, you bring in Preacher, just kind of size up Preachers, Shieldreds, Gix Command, gets you a little bit bigger. Tishana's Tidebinder could also be reasonable against a whole whack of activated abilities. So a couple decks. There's the Esper Pixie version. So this one's from Ryu. They went to 41-21, but very similar idea. This one's playing things like Entity Tracker as a card advantage engine. You have a Get Out in the main. Your white cards are for Nurturing Pixie in the main. Another way to bounce your effects, as well as Optimistic Scavenger. A lot of these cards are cheap enchantments, so you can redistribute counters and stuff like that for value. In the sideboard, you have access to like Sheltered by Ghosts as a way to gain like removal, but also potential life gain. Plays really nicely with sizing on Optimistic Scavenger. Lorne, Artifact Enchantment Hate, Graveyard Hate, Pest Control for the Go Wide decks that are cheap mana. Now, notably, this does hit your own creatures here. No More Lies in here as cheap counters, Destroy Evil for Enchantment Hate and big creature stuff, as well as Cut Down, kind of mixed into there. We then have the green-white Cage deck. So Doomwake was playing a lot of this, another content creator, ended up winning an RCQ with a Bant version that you can check out on their Twitter. Basically just blue lands for counterspells in the sideboard. Deck's got fairly reasonable watching him play against most of the meta, except for Sunfall decks. Sunfall decks usually do it in. But you have the Elf engine that lets you go into 2-drops fairly quickly. Core of the deck is a lot of your creatures ETB and create immediate value, multiple bodies. So all your 3-drops create 2 bodies. Pairing that with Collector's Cage lets you kind of cheat things out. So you have like Mistmoors as the key target in that case. A bunch of cheap removal with Get Lost and Sheltered by Ghost. Seraphic Steed can be a wall against aggro decks. Malira has pseudo protection, and then against all the discard decks you have Wiltleaf Liege, which also is an anthem for a lot of your green-white smaller creatures. Also Smite for aggressive decks, Destroy Evil for for enchantment and great big things, Invasion as hand hate, even Interrupter, all ways to kind of deal with the Sunfall decks. Try to hit their key pieces. Graveyard Hate, more sheltered for the red matchups, Split Up for sweepers, for like creature mirrors. Wiltleaf for the discard decks, and then Thrun for the heavy counterspell decks or targeted removal. And then lastly, we featured this last week, but the blue-white Omni combo deck. So this version, kind of the core is the same. The how you win could be slightly different in terms of which cards in your sideboard. So this one's from Ali Eldrazi, another content creator, 23-8 with it. So the core of the deck is drawing, discarding, looting cards into your graveyard. What you want to do is get into your graveyard Omniscience. With Omniscience, you reanimate it with Abuelo's Awakening. And then ideally what you would do is put another Omniscience into play. From there, so that just kind of protects it because Abuelo makes it a creature. If you do have the Omniscience in play though, like as a creature form, if you have counters, it could protect your combo. From there, you would either draw cards until you could hit Invasion of Arcavius or have it already in hand. With Invasion, what you do is you go into your sideboard, you get Beseech the Mirror. Beseech the Mirror gets you your second invasion. Second invasion gets you This Town Ain't Big Enough. And then you bounce back your 2 invasions. You cast Invasion, one gets This Town Ain't Big Enough, the other gets Heroic Reinforcements. And then you just kind of keep doing that loop, bouncing these back, getting these back, making a bunch of creatures with haste. And then you kill your opponent that way there. Your sideboard has Disenchants for Graveyard Hate. Or like mainly for that, Rest in Peace, so got Ghost Vacuum, things of that nature. Grand Abolisher for counterspell decks or things that are looking to interact on your turn. Cheap counters and negate. Fearless Recycling can be used as a recycle effect pretty much. Temporary Lockdown for the aggressive decks. Day of Judgment, same idea there. That's it for the week. Let me know what you've been playing, what you've been liking, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching.